Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. It's Saturday, our last show of the week, and on the show today we have an update from Ukraine. We're talking about Morocco and phosphates, and we have all the latest news from the Africa Cup of Nations. First up, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov have held talks in Geneva over the Ukraine crisis. Yesterday's high-stakes meeting was the end of Blinken's whistle-stop European tour, where he's trying to get commitments from the US's European allies on how to respond to what the West has been calling an imminent invasion of Ukraine. Lavrov, on the other hand, called for an end to this anti-Russia rhetoric and said his country poses no threat to anyone. Moscow has consistently denied planning any attack and demands that the US-headed NATO military alliance end all activity in Western Europe. Prashant is in studio now. Prashant, you've been covering this story closely. What do you make of the latest round of talks?
I'm almost inclined to say your guess is good as mine because, there's been like this flurry of discussions, flurry of statements all over the place.
Yeah.
A couple of things I think, one important thing to note is that many experts have kind of argued that this maybe also served as a bit of a delaying tactic on the part of the United States because the US was supposed to respond in concrete terms in written to Russia's demands. They were supposed to do it this week, and now that response has been shifted to next week. So it's a question as to whether this was part of Blinken's agenda as well, because Russia has posed the questions very clearly in terms of what it sees as minimum requirements to, for a stable and secure Europe. Like we discussed on the show before, these include no more further expansion of NATO, no intermediate range missiles, nuclear missiles, no missiles that can target Moscow, for instance, no military exercises in the vicinity of Russia by NATO, which has been happening. So these are very clear-cut demands, and the United States has of course promised to give it in writing. Even there, they're fubbing a bit in the sense that they're saying they'll address these questions. Russia says they will respond. The US says they'll address it. So a lot of wordplay, so to speak, at really in play there. And this also comes on in the aftermath of, like we discussed before, various sections of the US establishment talking about war. Joe Biden on Wednesday first said that a small incursion does not really count as war per se. Then after a lot of after a lot of noise, he quickly said that no, any movement of Russian troops into Ukraine is an act of war. Important thing, of course, is that Russia has again time and again said that it does not want to invade Ukraine, like you pointed out. Observers have noted, of course, that entering Ukraine militarily will be a massive disaster for Russia. It will also be a massive disaster for the Western powers, let's have no doubt about it. Yeah. But it could also be extremely problematic for Russia because like experiences in Afghanistan, like experiences in Iraq have proved time and again, you really cannot send troops in and control territory like that, especially in the history, considering the history of the relations between these countries. So I think the talk of war is definitely being hyped up much more than probably it should be. The United States and the Western powers are definitely using this talk of war as a bargaining tool in the discussions. I have to be very clear about it because the number of times US sources have said war could break out at a moment's notice. The moment has not, for good reason, and it's a great thing that the moment has not come. We don't want the moment to come. But the continuous talk of how war could break out at a moment's notice is extremely disruptive. And I think that on the other hand, Russia has also sort of, they have announced new military drills because they're also, I think, using their force projection as a diplomatic tool, right, in this situation. So I think we need to really wait for next week and see what kind of responses the United States and the West make. There is hope that cooler heads and wiser counsel will prevail on this. The fact that both sides will come up with certain arrangements which are to the satisfaction of both, at least temporarily, and not let this situation escalate further because some of the key questions, again, we talked about this before, some of the key questions are already moot. There is no question of Ukraine entering NATO anytime soon. There is no reason for nuclear missiles or missiles targeting Moscow to be deployed in
on Russia's borders,
close to Russia. So how these questions will be really addressed by the United States remains a major concern. And I think we need to probably wait and see next week. This diplomacy, of course, is good in the sense that it does give a sense that, the continuous engagement at least is a sign of hope. But we need to probably wait for next week and see.
Right. So on the sidelines, Prashant, several of the US's allies, from offering loans to military aid, whether it's Canada or the Balkan states or Poland even, many jumping onto the bandwagon. What is the end game here from a Western point of view?
So I think you get the sense that United American diplomacy is really working hard to sort of convey this impression of a united West. That's a very important thing we need to understand, because a lot of indications do, make it appear that the West is not really on the same page on this issue. And when we talk about the West, who do we mean? We talk about the various European countries. So we do know, of course, that the Eastern European countries are far more closer to the line of the United States, because there is, they traditionally, especially many of them have been captured by right-wing powers. There is a very strong anti-Russian sentiment that prevails in many of these governments. It is often used as an electoral tool as well. So they are, of course, likely to welcome the deployment of US or NATO missiles on their territory, for instance, as some kind of strategic, weapon that they have in these issues. The Western European countries, on the other hand, I think are far, far less inclined. And we're talking primarily about Germany and France here. The United Kingdom probably is far more closer to the US, as to be expected. But Germany and France, really is a big question in terms of whether they want to, they are truly committed to any kind of military conflict, or, even escalation with short of a conflict, because like we talked about, the energy needs of both these countries are very closely tied to Russia. In fact, Germany is, I wouldn't say on the throes of a crisis, but could be seeing an energy crisis due to gas supplies being restricted. And France also knows that its energy relations are very close. There is an entire issue of the region's economic development here, because the use of even a very small engagement could disrupt a lot of commerce, could disrupt a lot of supplies, and that region is very closely interconnected. So I think that there is no real appetite. On the other hand, a lot of these are probably also symbolic moves. Sending, announcing aid, sending some amount of weaponry, etc., etc. Whether this is actually preparation for war, I'm personally slightly skeptical. Again, like I said, it's forced projection, so to speak. So, but we definitely need to see, and of course, also absolutely hope that this does not turn into an all-out escalation.
Yeah, absolutely. And you rightly brought up Afghanistan in the context, because some of these shipments include things like Stinger missiles and Javelin missiles, which for generations we've seen as a sort of building block towards these kind of conflicts.
Right.
All right, thanks very much for the update, Prashant. The Kingdom of Morocco, after its annexation of Western Sahara, holds 72% of global phosphate reserves. In late 2021, the Moroccan government announced close to 6.5 billion US dollars in export earnings from phosphates. Globetrotter chief correspondent Vijay Prashad has a piece out today detailing the situation in Western Sahara and how, far from helping build peace, the Abraham Accords are accelerating a return to war in this part of Africa. We spoke to Vijay earlier via video conference.
Vijay, thank you so much for joining us. So you've recently done a piece which People's Dispatch has also published from Globetrotter on on various dimensions of the conflict in Western Sahara, on the oppression and the occupation of Western Sahara. So, of course, one aspect is what is happening at the diplomatic level, and one aspect is the economy behind it. So maybe let's start with the economics itself. So could you take us through what's the politics of phosphate, so to speak?
Well, phosphates are a key part of fertilizer. The other is nitrogen. Nitrogen is easy, you get it from the air. Phosphate harder. Much of the world's phosphate, it turns out, that are known are in both Morocco and in Western Sahara. If you add these two together, the bulk of the world's phosphates come from there. Now, the issue is that Western Sahara is technically a contested zone since it got out of Spanish colonialism. It used to be Spanish Sahara. 1975, it got independence. It was immediately claimed by Mauritania and Morocco. Mauritania subsequently released the claim. A national liberation movement called Polisario developed among the Sahrawi people. There was an armed struggle from 75 to a ceasefire in 1991. In that period, it was only basically smuggling of phosphate out of Western Sahara because there was an armed struggle. Since 1991, since the ceasefire deal, unfortunately, the ceasefire deal established a UN mission in Western Sahara, but it didn't prevent the removal of phosphates. This is a violation of the Geneva Convention. If an area is under occupation, you can't change the facts on the ground. You can't profit from the area under occupation. But sadly, the ceasefire deal doesn't establish that the Kingdom of Morocco is an occupying power, which would make the entire phosphate industry in Western Sahara illegal. it's not illegal, and yet, these are conflict phosphates that are being removed. And because of the kind of hue and cry about Western Sahara and conflict phosphates, many companies, including in the United States, Canada, and so on, have stopped directly buying phosphates from Morocco or from Western Sahara. This is now left to two companies in New Zealand and one company in India, which essentially launder conflict phosphates into fertilizer and sell it on the world market. So there's a lot of money made. I mean, Morocco made about almost $6.5 billion last year in exporting phosphates for a country that doesn't have oil or other commodities. Phosphate is the game in town. Phosphate, and I should say hashish, but it's really phosphates. That's the money that the state earns, and they're earning a part of it, not all of it, a part of it from their occupation of Western Sahara.
Right, Vijay, in this context, also globally, what is happening right now on the diplomatic front, so to speak, on this issue? Because we do know the Abraham Accords massively changed the situation when it comes to diplomatic relations as well.
Well, since the 1991 ceasefire in Western Sahara, the government of Morocco, the Kingdom of Morocco, and the Polisario Front, which is largely based in Algeria, these formations have been in various talks to basically dial down the tension, to create perhaps a different structure for Western Sahara, independence, autonomy, etc. All kinds of things have been on the table. During this period, there has been actually quite good faith talks in a way, and especially in the recent period under the former personal envoy of the UN Secretary General in Western Sahara. There have been talks, and these talks, I mean, they didn't actually come up with anything, but he was the former German president, Horst Kohler. He brought people together to Geneva. Polisario was there, and so on. That ended in 2019. The next year, in 2020, in August, the Trump administration upended the entire apple cart, or rather the phosphate cart, because what the Trump administration did was they said to the King of Morocco, you need to recognize Israel. Secondly, we will sell you weapons, including advanced drones, which you can use in Western Sahara against the Polisario if there's a return to fighting. And thirdly, we recognize your annexation of Western Sahara. Trump said there's no other realistic outcome of this, so we just recognize it. Well, having recognized Morocco's illegal annexation of Western Sahara, what this provided is it provided the Moroccan kingdom to essentially say, we don't need to negotiate with anybody. And the war has essentially opened up, particularly at the borderlands near Mauritania. This is very significant, and it may draw in Algeria. Don't know exactly who all will get drawn into, but Trump's Abraham Accords threaten a new war in Western Sahara, serious war in Western Sahara. And this is just what the people of the region do not need.
And finally, the Africa Cup of Nations is currently on in Cameroon, as you might be aware. The tournament's group phase concluded yesterday with some surprises. I spoke to football writer Vaibhav Raghunandan for an update from the tournament.
I think the big talking points is that the defending champions Algeria have been knocked out. They finished bottom of their group, actually. They didn't even get a single win. They were beaten handily by Ivory Coast, although in all fairness, it was a much closer game than the scoreline would say. They needed some points from that to even get through as the best third place team. But unfortunately, they couldn't. They ended up losing 3-1. Riyad Mahrez, who is perhaps the biggest star at the AFCON, ended up hitting the post with a penalty. And Nicolas Pepe, perhaps the most overrated star at the AFCON, ended up scoring an absolute beaut of a goal. Also, I think this is in terms of results, in terms of the fact that Algeria are defending champions. They have a star-studded squad. They were supposed to do very well, and they've been knocked out. The real big story is that Comoros, an archipelago with like 3 islands, which is making its debut at AFCON and is ranked like 132nd in the world, which for all our listeners is lower than India. They beat Ghana 3-2. They'd never scored a goal at AFCON. They'd lost their first 2 group games, and they ended up scoring 3 goals to beat a Ghana team that had the Ayew brothers and Thomas Partey in the squad. They beat them. I would say they went 2-0 up. Then Jordan Ayew got sent off. After that, they scored one more. Their biggest player is he holds Serbian citizenship also. His name is Ben Nabuane, and he plays for Red Star Belgrade. It was a huge win because if you also see the celebration videos, like it was a massive win for Comoros. They never expected to get this far. They've come this far and they've beaten a team that has won several AFCONs and is regularly among the favorites. So it was like really, really good to watch also the game.
Right, fair enough. So Comoros, of course, one of the good stories. Gabon also as debutants making it through to the round of 16. Round of 16, is it?
No, Gabon are not debutants. They hosted it last time, so they were there.
Right,
time.
okay. Right. So off the field, Weber, there were some doubts over Cameroon's preparedness to host the tournament and all of that. But so far, at least reports indicating that things are going off pretty smoothly. And a vindication of sorts. There was that whole conversation happening about whether the tournament might get postponed and all of that. And the Cameroonians came out very clearly saying that they will go ahead and preparations are in place. And this kind of approach from UEFA, or not UEFA, but European footballing bodies indicated a kind of superciliousness in a way.
So, yeah, I mean, I think most of the concerns expressed by European clubs, I won't even say countries, was because of the protocols that their countries have, their borders have regarding people coming back from Africa, especially with the Omicron wave variant. It was based more on politics than on reality. Almost all of their arguments for these players traveling out. Any judgments that were made about Cameroon not being able to host it was actually pressure just created by European clubs who are going to lose a lot of players, which also tells you the amount of talent they have in Europe playing from Africa. Every club in the Premier League, I would say the top 4 clubs have lost a lot of players to the AFCON. Lost a lot of players in the sense that these players have gone to represent their nation. Yes, there have been a few cases. There have been a few COVID positives in and around the AFCON. Most famously, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang tested positive. And then after that, they detected lesions in his heart because of COVID, which he said they're not of concern. And he's come back to Arsenal. And both of them, not the club haven't, but he's come out and said that there's nothing to be concerned about. So, yeah, it's been as good a tournament as any. We're conducting one right now in India, and it's the same thing. These are COVID times. They're unprecedented times. There are going to be glitches. Everyone's adjusting as we go along.
Right. Finally, Weber, next round of matches, what are you looking forward to most on the pitch?
I am looking forward to Comoros playing Cameroon, actually. They're taking on the host, and it's a huge deal. It's going to be a big game. I don't see them obviously beating Cameroon, but why not? We all read fairy tales in our youth, and why not read one from Africa this time around?
All right, fair enough. So hopefully we'll get to catch that game as well. Comoros versus Cameroon, the host, the fourth smallest nation in Africa, I think, if I'm not wrong. Against what is, at least in footballing terms, definitely a powerhouse. So lots to look forward to from the Africa Cup of Nations. And like Weber said, the Asian Women's Cup is also on. So we'll have updates for you on that as well soon. Thanks very much, Weber, for the update. That's all we have on the show for today and for this week. In fact, we'll be back on Monday with another episode of Daily Debrief. In the meantime, you can get updates on all of these stories from our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and also give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms. See you next week. Stay safe. Goodbye.